Afternoon, everyone. As the academic director of the State Oversight Academy of the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy, I am delighted to welcome you to our first academic practitioner symposium. The State Oversight Academy is developing many strategies to improve state oversight activities and public accountability in state governments. Through activities like the symposium today, the Levin Center seeks to promote collaboration between academics and practitioners. Academic researchers offer a broad perspective on state politics and policies. Practitioners' experience and expertise provide insights into the implementation and day-to-day operation of some of these very same policies. We hope that these collaborative relationships will achieve two objectives. First, grounding academic research in the realities of day-to-day governing and expanding the options and perspectives of both practitioners and academics in their work. Papers presented in today's symposium consider the difficulties of implementing transparency and accounting and procurement agencies. They consider safeguarding elections by moving them away from partisan political control, and they explore the potential impact of interest group conflicts of interest in policymaking. This broad range of topics reflects the inclusive view that the Levin Center takes on oversight. Oversight is more than just grilling officials and public actors in committee hearings. It involves accountability, transparency, and a commitment to good government. With that, I hope you find today's papers and the comments from practitioners enlightening. Thank you for coming, and I'll turn this over to Jim Townsend.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend. I'm director of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy, and I just want to join Professor Sarbat Thompson in welcoming you to today's Oversight Symposium. I'm going to moderate one of the panels. And to kick things off, I just would like to describe the format for today's symposium. Today, we will be having a symposium consisting of 3 panels featuring scholars presenting a paper and practitioners who will provide comments on the paper. And then that will be followed by a Q&A session that everyone is welcome to participate in, including the audience. A little bit more specifics about each panel. So the scholars will take roughly 10 minutes to present their papers. A practitioner will then who has read the paper will then provide comments for about 10 minutes. And then we'll have a final 10 minutes of Q&A. And we very much encourage everyone in the audience to submit questions in the Q&A function on the Zoom on your screen there. And we'll do our best. Each moderator will do their level best to get to as many questions as possible during the time period we have. So I'm now going to kick things off and introduce the scholars who are going to present the first paper. That paper is entitled Efficacy of Congressional Oversight, and it comes from Professor Seth Hill and Professor Pamela Ban, who are both from the University of California, San Diego. Let me say a couple words about their backgrounds. Professor Hill is in the Department of Political Science, where he studies citizens and how they motivate politician behavior with interests in how voters learn about politics, political participation, vote choice, representation, and legislative politics. Professor Hill is the author of Frustrated Majorities, which was published by Cambridge University Press, and he's written more than 35 peer-reviewed articles in journals, including the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, among many others. Professor Hill received his PhD from UCLA, and he held a doctoral appointment at Yale University. Professor Pamela Ban is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, also, as I mentioned, at the University of California, San Diego. Her research interests are in American political institutions and cover legislative politics, Congress, interest groups, and information dynamics within the federal government. Her current work focuses on how political actors such as legislators, bureaucrats, and interest groups search for, exchange, and use information during policymaking. Her research has been published in the American Political Science Review, Quarterly of Journal of Political Science, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and other publications. She received her PhD from Harvard University. And our reviewer is going to be Joe Coletti. I'm going to introduce Joe after Professor Hill and Professor Ban present their paper. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Professor Hill and Professor Ban to provide a presentation on their paper. Please take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us in the symposium today. I'm going to start today with an example from the General Services Administration. In October 2010, the GSA held its Western Regions Conference in Las Vegas. This was an internal conference billed as a team-building affair. A 2012 Inspector General report, though, revealed that this conference had excessive and wasteful spending and did not follow procurement laws or policy. And even before the conference, there were scouting trips in Vegas, of course, that cost over $100,000. And the report included pages and pages of violations that it discovered, including improperly disclosing confidential information, providing free rooms to a contractor's employees, spending an inordinate amount on food, that number doesn't even include dinners, beverages, and team building training, including $75,000 for a one-day training involving 24 bicycles. Now, this behavior stands in contrast to the GSA's stated mission of delivering effective and efficient government services for the American people. And so Congress called the GSA in to further investigate what happened and questioned GSA officials in multi-day hearings. And the revelations eventually led to resignations, firings, and a criminal conviction for the administrator that led the organization of the conference. And during testimonies in front of the House, the GSA Inspector General testified that the proceedings and investigations show that the oversight system worked. But how do we think about whether or not oversight actually works? This GSA debacle is an example of the difficult principal agent problem that Congress faces with the bureaucracy. Now, Congress authorizes and oversees the bureaucracy, but this isn't an easy task because of informational and contractual challenges that constrain Congress's control. Some scholars say that Congress does indeed have and maintain political control over the bureaucracy because Congress itself has the power to design administrative procedures and institutions to do so. But other scholars, on the other hand, say that these congressional tools are in fact limited and the bureaucracy is more responsive to perhaps the executive and not the legislature. Generally, though, political scientists have characterized oversight as the main tool for Congress to control executive agents. But how effective is congressional oversight? And this is the question that Seth and I are asking. So existing empirical work has shown us when Congress performs oversight, what happens in oversight hearings, and what can affect the perception of oversight. But there's surprisingly very little in academic research on the actual effectiveness of oversight. And this is probably because there is a huge challenge in assessing the efficacy of oversight. In order to do so properly, in order to assess this properly, we need to take what Congress wants and compare it to what the bureaucracy delivers, to bureaucratic outcomes. But this is a hard problem and a hard challenge to overcome because the bureaucracy produces public goods and a wide variety of services. It's hard and some may say impossible to quantify bureaucratic output, especially in a way that is comparable across different settings, different programs, and across time. Not only do we need a quantitative comparable measure, but ideally we would also need a measure that isolates the request that the bureaucracy receives. Something that, for example, sets aside party politics, since two parties may want different things from the bureaucracy, or that sets aside interbranch competition, given that the bureaucracy faces demands from both the executive and the legislature. And finding a measure that satisfies these conditions is a very hard challenge. But Seth and I have found a measure that gets us there, or at least very close. And that's by looking at the improper payments of executive agencies. And the OMB defines improper payments as any payment that should not have been made, or that was made in an incorrect amount under statutory or legal requirements. They're a bureaucratic deficiency measured in dollars every fiscal year and is plausibly comparable across time and agencies. And even better, legislators from both parties, as well as presidents, have all wanted the same thing with improper payments. They've all wanted them to decrease. And this is a large fiscal issue that Congress and the president have focused on since the late 1990s, when the GAO first revealed $19.1 billion in improper payments from just 9 agencies. And since then, there have been 5 statutes targeted at reducing and eliminating these payments, as well as various executive orders, OMB guidance, and Inspector General reports. And Congress has conducted a lot of oversight itself on this matter. And we're able to measure congressional efforts at oversight on this by identifying all hearings addressing improper payments. And we do this by starting with all congressional hearings and collecting those that focused specifically on improper payments. And our process to do this yields 131 hearings held by the House and Senate on improper payments from 1968 through 2021. And these hearings have called in various agencies and a varying number of witnesses each fiscal year. And by looking at these hearings on improper payments, we know when Congress has conducted oversight on the matter. And not only that, we know specifically on which agencies it has done so. Now, on the improper payments data side, we take advantage of the statutory reporting that programs deemed high risk are required to do every fiscal year. They have to sample their payments and estimate improper payment rates every year by law. And these rates are published online at the government website, paymentAccuracy.gov. And we combine this data with earlier data that we collected from historical agency annual financial reports. And this allows us to calculate an annual improper payment rate, or IP rate, by agency for years 2000 through 2021. So here's a quick look at how these IP rates look for some of the 26 agencies in our data. These are just 10 on the slide here, but from this, we can see that the IP rate varies by agency and varies within agencies across time. We can see that clearly for certain agencies like the Department of Transportation in green or the Education Department in purple here. And the Department of Treasury at the top has remained as the agency with the highest agency IP rate. Their IP rate is largely driven by the earned income tax credit. For our measure of oversight, we're looking at the congressional hearings on improper payments. And specifically, we code a treatment of oversight if the agency was called to testify in at least one hearing on improper payments in a fiscal year. And we also code data on variables that proxy for the strength or quality of oversight. For example, the number of witnesses, the number of hearings, the length of these hearings, and other characteristics like whether there's unified government or if it's a presidential election year. Now, we're going to estimate the effect of these improper payment hearings on IP rates by using a two-way fixed effects identification strategy, where our outcome variable is going to measure the IP rate for an agency each year. And our independent variables are going to measure whether an agency, its witness, testified in at least one oversight hearing on improper payments that year. But of course, because it may take time post-oversight hearing for agencies to enact reforms to improve their improper payments post-hearing, we also estimate a linear trend in improper payments in the years following a hearing. Now, if oversight leads to an improvement in the agency's IP rates after a hearing, then the IP rate should improve in the years afterwards and yield a negative coefficient right here. So I'll note that we estimate this model for the agency level IP rates, which I'll show today, but we also do this for the lower program level IP rates, and the results in the program level are similar. So what do we find? Our results show statistically significant negative coefficients on the years since last agency hearing variable. We find that each year after an oversight hearing, there's around a 0.01 percentage point decline in the improper payment rate. And the third column here separates out House hearings from Senate ones and show that both House and Senate hearings lead to subsequent declines in proper payments. I should also note here that our model is holding constant all agency characteristics like policy domain and relative budget size, as well as fiscal year characteristics like economic conditions or, say, the focus of the presidential administration. Now, we also have additional specifications that dig a little deeper to look at whether there are characteristics for strength or quality of oversight. We have a specification that accounts for the cumulative effect of multiple hearings across time for an agency. And we also have a specification that addresses an econometrics issue with the statistical model that we use. And across the board, we don't find anything in particular that sticks out differently from our main findings. And overall, we still find a dynamic effect of a hearing at around the same size as in the main findings. Now, to just pause and sum up our findings on the efficacy of oversight hearings, we find that oversight hearings lead to around a 0.1 to 0.2 percentage point decline in the improper payment rate of agencies each year beyond an oversight hearing. Now, this seems to lead to the conclusion that oversight works. But if we view this size of this effect against the median or dollar-weighted means, this story doesn't look as rosy, especially compared to the dollar-weighted mean of almost 8%. A 0.1 to 0.2 percentage point decline then is small in relative magnitude, leading us to conclude that congressional oversight has limited effect. Now, these hearings aren't the only tool, of course, that can be used to control the bureaucracy. And we find limited effect of oversight hearings, but what about other channels of tools, perhaps not traditionally considered oversight, but that are still available to use to try and influence bureaucratic performance? And we look at three groups in particular, and we'll go more into detail about these in our paper, but in light of time, I'll only briefly preview them here. So for non-hearing techniques, we examine correspondence between legislators and agencies. For our setting of bureaucratic improper payments, though, we only find extremely few of these individual contacts between legislators and agencies to be about improper payments. So this channel doesn't seem to be used by legislators for bureaucratic payment issues. We also look at appropriation committee reports where committees can instruct agencies on priorities and requirements. We searched these reports and identified the ones on improper payments, and we don't, across the board, we don't find them to be effective. There's wide variability on the report's effect on improper payment rates. And so then we turn to see if the executive perhaps drives efficiency or has control over bureaucrats. And as I previewed earlier in the presentation, there have been a series of major executive actions addressed at reducing improper payments. And the ones of note are the executive orders, OMB memoranda, and statutes in these four fiscal years here. And so we can look in the aggregate at whether the trends in overall improper payment rates have responded to these years. And we see these vertical bars represent those 4 years, and this is the overall aggregate improper payment rate. And there's some evidence of a downward response downward response following the 2010 executive actions, but we really don't see a pattern of decline in the wake of the 2013, 2014, or the 2020 executive actions. And so to conclude, our findings imply that there are stark limits on Congress's best known and widely discussed tool for oversight of hearings. Other channels of oversight or executive actions aren't clearly superior. And so this leaves a rather significant bureaucratic deficiency in place of large economic magnitude. Improper payments in the last fiscal year alone amounted to $247 billion. And overall, our study shows that America's elected officials may struggle to control the bureaucratic agents that are empowered to implement law. Thanks for your time, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Pamela, thanks so much for that really terrific presentation. And congratulations to you and Seth on what was really an excellent paper. I'm now going to introduce and then turn things over to Joe Coletti, who will give his comments in review of the paper. Joe is the North Carolina House of Representatives Oversight Staff Director. Joe leads the team that helps the House of Representatives in North Carolina ask the right questions and define the real problems. Joe has helped North Carolina and other states cut taxes by reining in spending since 2005. He led Governor Pat McCrory's Government Efficiency and Reform Initiative. In his current role, Joe has led investigations into COVID spending, hurricane recovery, and other government functions. Joe, we are so appreciative that you've taken the time to participate and review this paper, and I want to turn it over to you to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for all the help that the Levin Center provides to those of us in the States who are doing the work of oversight, including this symposium, and for the opportunity, especially to take a look at this paper from Pamela and from Seth. It was appreciated the approach that they took. The question that they asked is critical. Oversight needs oversight just as much as any government agency does. So accountability for oversight, it's a great idea. Let's see, does it actually work? What good is oversight if it doesn't actually change the behavior of the agencies that we're supposed to be monitoring? And their measures of oversight, both the taking a look at the number of hearings and using the improper payments as a measure of effectiveness, I thought were both really good. They're still imperfect, but they're quantifiable, and that's always a good starting point. So talked with some of the folks on my team about both of these, and one of the issues that came up was improper payments are a chronic problem. So why would we expect a one-time hearing to have a long-term impact on something that, as Pamela pointed out in the presentation and they point out in the paper, there are 5 laws that are in place to combat these. There are multiple executive orders. So what good is one more hearing going to do to affect the rate of improper payments? Pretty good question on that one. But again, glad that they're taking a look at it. Hearings are just one tool. Pamela listed some of the other options that are out there. And we as oversight staff are, whether in preparation for hearings, whether the hearing actually results, a lot of times we are taking a look at probing a number of issues at once. At the congressional level, improper payments are a huge concern. At the state level, when we're taking a look at improper payments, most of the time it's of federal money. So we just did a hearing recently on improper payments in our unemployment office, and that was a concern, and a lot of that came down to processes. And so I'll come back to that in a second when talking about just overall what the evidence that they present does show. But all those other activities and anything else that an agency does to respond, hard to measure. The outcomes are rare. It's everybody's excited with if there's an arrest, as in the GSA case, right? That's one of those, as people point to. That's usually what people point to as an example of oversight worked. The people who did the bad thing are no longer in their job. They're potentially behind bars if a criminal activity took place. And so people use that as a measure a lot of times because that's the egregious things. And so I appreciate the approach of taking a look at the improper payments, because that is a more mundane kind of problem. It is not a headline grabbing problem, but it is something that affects everybody. So taking a look at the evidence that they provide of the improper payment rates and the dollar amounts, we can see that a lot of times the what and the why of a program tells us a lot more about what the improper payments are going to what improper payments are going to be, more than the how the program is implemented. And oversight too often focuses on the how. And one of the things that we try to take a look at within here in North Carolina is try to get more to those whys and the whats. Why does the program exist? So if you take a look at the examples that were in the graphs, you have HHS, chronically high rate of overpayment and high dollar amount. That's Medicaid. Treasury, high rate of improper payments and high dollar amounts. That is largely earned income tax credits, because that's really complicated. And same with Medicaid payments. Those are things that individuals are doing, trying to understand what the rules are and be able to respond to that. And you can take a look at the Department of Labor line. It's relatively flat for most of it, and then you see this huge spike at the right end of it. That's pandemic. Those are programs that, by definition, were set up to have no accountability, or at least minimal accountability, right? The pandemic unemployment assistance, PUA program, was set up for people who are traditionally self-employed, contract workers, folks who don't have paychecks that can be verified against. And the Government Accountability Office and at the federal level has estimated somewhere between $100 billion and $135 billion of straight up fraud in that program. That's not even improper payments, that is straight fraud, because that was a huge program that was difficult to monitor and to implement. And so not surprising that you end up with bad numbers on that side, both in the rate and the dollar amount. You take a look at the other side of that, low rates of improper payments and low dollar amounts, personnel management. That's a clear, it's an agency that knows what it's supposed to do. It does it on a fairly routine basis. And it's also an agency that is responsible for the budget that it's maintaining and for the activity that it's doing, unlike DHHS, Treasury, things like that, where there's some significant remove from the payer and the customer of the service. Department of Transportation, pretty straightforward there as well, that they're just sending money out to state agencies who are doing routine construction and maintenance of federal roads. All of those things become easier to maintain and oversee within the agency, let alone at the congressional or at the state level. And then you have things with a high rate of improper payments and a low dollar amount, like the VA. You see that there's the spike there of improper payments, but in the rate, but a low dollar amount. Unemployment in most years, you can have a high rate of improper payments, but a low dollar amount, because in most years, especially when we're down 3% unemployment like now, it is not an issue. The improper payments during the pandemic were more than most states have in total unemployment payments in a normal year. So that's, again, about the volume, and what the program is doing is defining what the improper payment is. And so if we take a look more at that and try to get to those fundamental questions, whether it's C.S. Lewis, who says, right, we all want progress. Sometimes the most progressive person is the one who says, I'm going the wrong way, and turns around. The Peter Drucker always talks about effectiveness versus efficiency. Efficiency is doing things right, and effectiveness is doing the right things. And Jen Pelka, who, if you all haven't read her book, Recoding America yet, highly recommended. It's one that's in some conversations with some other academics, taking a look at programs within the state and in other areas. She's kind of become, you say her name and it's kind of like a shibboleth. People understand it. If they've read her book, they just chime right in and say, yes, she's exactly right. We need to take a look at what is it that we're misinterpreting or intentionally or otherwise, that leads us to do bad things. She has an example of GPS because there's an example in federal regulations that shows running data through a bus, that everybody says, well, we have to have a bus to connect our data plan to connect data across agencies. And really, that was just an example instead of being something that you must do. And we've seen that with the hurricane relief here in North Carolina, that our state agency came up with rules. HUD said it was okay, but there was no check of, is this the best way for us to do this? HUD just gave approval, and we don't know if it was the best way for the agency to actually make its rules. So those are some of the issues that are there. And oversight, really, the question is, when we're taking a look at agencies, do we take a look at agencies for their effectiveness, or programs for their effectiveness? Do we look at them for their efficiency? It's really easy to go in and take a look at an agency for its cell phone bill or for something like that. But some of these problems are either inherent in the policy, as I've already mentioned, or they get embedded, kind of like the Jen Palka example. They get things that the IT systems that we use, the chart of accounts that we use, the regulations that an agency uses to try to implement the law, or the ways that they interpret the rules that are already in place. Those things lead to a lot of difficulty in carrying out the activity. And so the more that, and that becomes really hard to do on an oversight level, but it's those kinds of questions are critical for those of us in the states or at the federal level to be able to take a look at and say, and try to understand how those are affecting either the improper payment or the effectiveness and efficiency of the state agencies that are doing the work. So appreciate the paper. It raised, as y'all gathered, a lot of questions for me about how should we be taking a look at that, and appreciate the way that they took a look at this, and and I always appreciate a paper like this one, where, as Pam said, there's a good measure and it looks like it's effective, but it's not really greatly effective. And so what else do we need to take a look at it? So when you can point to a thing, I have the tendency to say, well, this isn't pointing me in any really good direction. I'm gonna turn my attention elsewhere. So I appreciate when somebody follows through and says, this isn't exactly great, and it doesn't really, the thing that we're studying doesn't seem to be completely effective, but the fact that it opens it up and gets that out there, that it does a thing, but it doesn't do it the way that anybody would want, is important in its own right. So I appreciate the fact that Pamela and Seth did this paper, and that we had the chance to take a look at it today.
Well, Joe, thank you. Thanks so much for those insights. I wanted, before turning to questions, I wanted to give Seth and Pam an opportunity to respond to anything that Joe mentioned that you had thought you wanted to share.
Yes, thank you. Seth, do you want to?
So yes, thanks so much, Joe. These were great. You know, one question I had that I would love your take on is, it sort of seemed like you were suggesting that entitlements that are not funded through the annual budget process may have less effectiveness. Now, obviously, these entitlement programs have other features that are different, but one clear difference between transportation and these HHS programs and the EIC program is entitlement versus annual budget process. So I was just curious if you were suggesting that that was a distinguishing feature, or if it was the other factors.
I think overall it's kind of the other factors, because there's a book, I can't remember the first name of the author, but Shuck is his last name, professor at Yale, on why government doesn't work, I think, or something along those lines. But one of the things that he points out is that government is really good at writing checks. And so so Social Security, government is great at. Like, it's a very efficient system. It's more about how routine is the activity that's being done that is being paid, more than is it something that is annually, or is it something that's entitlement.
Also, Joe, just wanted to say thank you so much for your insights. They're very valuable. I have a question too to follow up. You said that you were just doing in a hearing on improper payment rates on the unemployment office. So, like, can you help us understand more? Like, what are some of the aims or the goals that you would have in an improper payment hearing like this?
So we were following up on 2 audits from our state auditor into our unemployment office, and she was actually doing that in response to some Department of Labor recommendations on improper payments. She also took a look at timeliness of payments, and that led to if you're looking at both the timeliness question and the improper payment question, there's a lot of process that goes into that. And so that was where our focus is what is the federal measure of that? Because DES, our unemployment office, has complained about the federal measure in the past. So what's a good way to measure improper payments? How do you monitor those? What's the system that you have in place to make sure people are filling out their forms properly? How much of it is simple mistakes that lead to other problems, and how much of it is deliberate attempts to do things? So we were trying to get to some of those, what's underlying the improper payments, more than to castigate them for having improper payments in the first place.
Thanks.
Yeah, and that's certainly, when we read the congressional hearing transcripts, it is much less castigation and much more help us understand the process. What resources can we provide to improve the process? Nonetheless, we don't seem to see subsequent dramatic improvement.
Well, let me interject here. We have several questions that I want to get to that are from the audience. So I'm going to hold off. I had several questions prepared, but I want to prioritize questions that are coming in from the audience. So I'm going to kick it off with the first question that we received, and it comes from Professor Sean Theriot of the University of Texas, who just happens to be the 2023-24 Levin Center Oversight Fellow. So we are so excited to have Sean join us today. Sean says he finds the paper really, really interesting, but in eyeballing the data, he was interested in how the data might vary over time. Today's Congress is a very different Congress from Congresses 5, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, kind of during the period that you studied. How do things change over time, that level of effectiveness of oversight that you found?
Yes. Hi, Sean. I think, yes. So we are using fiscal year fixed effects, and we could probably look at the size of those, the size of those fixed effects. I don't recall off the top of my head, but I remember just nothing. There were no years in particular that really stuck out as having more of an effect or less of an effect than other years. I don't recall any looking at any other across time differences, but that you're totally right in that, Congress today is not the same as Congress in 2000. We do look at some moderators to try and figure out, is there a moderating effect of if there's unified government versus divided government, if it's, a presidential election year, and we don't find anything that really sticks out amongst those moderators either. Seth, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Oh, I mean, I guess the quick reaction, I think maybe Sean was asking, is if we interacted the hearing variables with time.
Oh, yes.
Could we see some lower effectiveness in more recent Congresses? I don't believe we've run that specification. We can do that. That seems like a good idea. I will say that later hearing transcripts look a lot like hearing transcripts from the early 2000s. So while Congress in total might be a lot different, there are still, it seems to me, enough members who care about this issue to have reasonably productive conversations in these oversight hearings. One neat observation was that Rob Portman was the OMB director in the mid 2000s and issued a couple of these OMB guidance memos. And of course, he subsequently became a senator. So I think that even in the, yes, he's gone now. I know, Sean. Okay, but you know, even the 2019 act, you know, seems like one of a similar flavor of what was going on earlier.
Great. Let me keep going because we've got several questions I'd love to get to. Jason Jeffress, who is with the Office of the DC Auditor, has a question which goes like this: did you think of looking at GAO reports on improper payments as an example of congressional oversight?
Yes, of course. There's a lot of GAO involvement in this, and they issue a lot of reports and guidance as well. The main difference between the GAO reports and, let's say, the oversight hearings that we have in the first that we look at in the first part are that the oversight hearings are targeted at individual agencies, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of the GAO reports are bureaucracy wide. And so if that is the case, then we can look at the reports and see if, you know, there is, again, an effect from that year across all the agencies. Though we could see this, we could look into whether or not those GAO reports, if there are targeted ones to just a specific agency or a specific group of agencies, for sure.
I think there are a couple GAO reports that are, you know, Medicare, Medicaid specific. You know, one of the challenges to all of these really great ideas is that because IP rates are measured at the annual level, and there could be a hearing, there could be an executive order, there could be a GAO report that all happen in the same year. And so it's very hard for us to untangle if there were an effect. Was it the hearing? Was it the GAO report? Was it the OMB guidance? Was it some combination of the three? But I love all these ideas because we can think about ways to try to get somewhere on them.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I'm thinking of a lot of different ways that we could advance, you know, understanding here. Even, I mean, Joe's suggestion coming from the state level that, you know, in many instances we've got programs that are the money is actually being spent at the state level. And so there's a layer of oversight that may or may not be happening at the state level that probably should be taken account of. And that's one of the things the State Oversight Academy is focused on doing, which is to try to build a community of leaders at the state level who really are passionate and effective in oversight as best as we can measure, of course, and maybe perhaps influencing and partnering with people at the federal level. Because it is a complex undertaking. Let me keep going here. Dan Johnson, another member of the audience, has a modeling question. Understanding this, he probably needs to be a brief answer, but he wonders about the relationship between the variables, linear modeling, normal distribution. What can you say, I guess, relatively briefly about that?
Oh, go ahead.
No, you take it, Pam.
Oh yeah, we are using the easiest answer is we're using a linear model. We're estimating a linear model there.
It is a IP rate, so it is a bounded variable, but because they're kind of clustered in these low digits, it's sort of a reasonable approximation.
Okay, next question. We got about 10 minutes. Before we have to move on to our next panel, so let me keep chugging through here. Quentin Wilson has a question, and I'll just read it here. Oversight is primarily highlighted as an after-action intervention, often experienced as a gotcha once the cows are out of the barn. Are the authors or Joe aware of examples of states doing more thorough various performance improvement strategies to prevent wrongful payments?
Yeah, excellent. So yes, so so first with the oversight hearings, like we were mentioning earlier, a lot of these hearings are similar to what Joe was describing, to what they were doing in their oversight hearing on with the unemployment program. Most of these oversight hearings, of course, do start by, if we read the transcripts, of course, they do start by showing the problem and, like showing the size of the problem and saying, this is a problem and we need to fix it. But the bulk of the hearing is actually exactly what matches similarly to what Joe was talking about with his hearing, which is they're digging into getting information on exactly what was getting information on what was happening on they're trying to look at their payment systems. They're trying to look at the actions that the corrective actions that the agencies may have put into place, and whether or not and how the implementation and execution of those corrective actions were how they were going. And every agency actually is also these programs that are reporting improper payment rates are also in every year required to report to submit and report a corrective action plan, in which they have to lay out a specific plan as to how they are going to focus, or how they're going to in the next year, what they're going to do to try and reduce or improve their payments activity.
And yeah, the taking a look at the process, that is a large part of, and one of the values of taking a look at improper payments is that these are chronic things. These are ongoing programs. So any hearing that you have not only is backward looking, as Pam was just describing, but it's also forward looking and saying, how do you fix this to address, to make sure that the next payment works well? And taking a look at the hurricane hearings that we did, we had the hearing started with that the agency that's in charge of that at the state level, as we are 6 years removed from the first hurricane that they are providing payments for, and trying to get people rehoused and get their houses repaired and up to speed for being resilient against a future hurricane. And the hearings there were taking a look not just at how quickly are you spending your money? Are you spending your money well? But are you getting people home? Again, how effective is the program itself? Not just how efficient are you, and are you getting payments out properly? And because we're still in the middle of the work that they're doing, the legislature has been able to provide some statutory attempts to improve the process that they have, to make it more effective, to make it more efficient. Some of those things, one of the statutory approaches that was taken was in response to some recommendations from the agency itself, saying, and the legislature said, well, if you're not able to do that now, how can we provide a piece of legislation that will help you accomplish that? And that's the same as we see in part with the federal legislation that's been done on improper payments that were highlighted in the paper, and throughout, whether it's improper payments or other things, the legislature and statute can be undertaken in the process based on the responses to say, let's try some other approaches, and not just hold the agency accountable for doing things, but also what are the statutory barriers that are getting in the way of being able to be effective and efficient with your payment.
We've got time for a couple more questions. I want to keep going with audience questions because these are really outstanding. Michael Stern has a question about GAO. His question really focuses on whether whether our scholars looked. How much did you consider GAO's impact, or do you see a way in which you could compare the impact of, say, a GAO report versus an oversight hearing? I realize oftentimes GAO reports are featured. GAO is often featured to testify at a hearing. But how did you, or is there a way to disentangle those things and look at kind of the impact that each might have?
Yeah, I think that is a tough issue. As Jim suggests, a lot of times, well, there are GAO witnesses, and the GAO reports are often I don't know if they're the precipitating event, but they are a central feature of the hearing itself. So, short answer is no. We haven't done that, what would be valuable to us, which is information I don't know, is how does GAO decide when or when not to write a report? Because you could imagine a study that, so the statute requires, particularly since 2014, each agency to have an accountable official who is accountable for the improper payment rates within the agency. And so you can imagine improper payment reforms could either come from within the agency on that accountable official side, or outside of the agency from the GAO side. So a statistical study would say, are there settings where a GAO report doesn't happen that might have happened, or where a accountable official generates a report, and that's what prompts the hearing. But ultimately, it is subject to the difficult problem I mentioned earlier, which is we measure improper payment rates once per year, and lots of these different influences on agency behavior are happening within year multiple times per year. And so statistically speaking, it's very difficult to know which feature is having which influence.
Let me keep going, just as we've got just a few minutes left. We have an anonymous participant who just wonders about the influence of AI. Obviously, something that a lot of people are talking about. Maybe that's not something we can tackle too efficiently here, but any thoughts about sort of how AI might improve legislative oversight?
I'll just start with the AI depends on the data that's coming into it, and the data from agencies is usually slow or sometimes inaccurate. So I'm not sure how much more AI can provide based on the inputs.
There is, I did read somewhere that an agency was trying to come up with a machine learning model to predict improper payments as a way to anticipate where they are more and less likely to come from. But so perhaps machine learning or AI could help us with discovering features and anticipating characteristics of programs that might be subject to reform.
Interesting. Okay, maybe one more question. I'll try to get to a second one. We have Jesse Crossan is asking a question about the influence of interest groups on the effectiveness of oversight. Have you in the past, or did you consider that issue as you were putting this paper together?
That's a really good point, Jesse. And as we know, like in the academic literature, right, like the very traditional view of oversight as fire alarm oversight really, relies on interest groups to sound the alarm or raise or discover and raise the issue and bring it to the attention of Congress. We can. So actually, I'll just say in light of time. One way, we can observe, it's hard to observe, right, like the role of interest groups, because a lot of that happens behind closed doors. But one thing we could look at would be, in these hearings, most of the time it's mainly bureaucrats, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of these oversight hearings also had individuals or witnesses from interest groups or other organizations, non-government, the non-agency organizations come and testify as well. And so we didn't look at that, but that would be that would be an interesting avenue to pursue.
Great. Well, any other comments?
They do affect. They do have an influence on what gets looked at, because they do raise, as Pamela said, they raise the alarm that can lead to the look, whether they're included in the hearing or not. It is sometimes those outside groups that are saying we were hurt by this process, or it is not effective, and is or the folks that we look out for are being harmed by the process.
Let me conclude with a question that comes from a veteran of the California General Assembly who was chair of its Rules Committee and was really an influential leader, continues to be, even though he's no longer in the legislature, Ken Cooley. And Ken just wonders if the panel could reflect on sort of Pamela, you started talking about a little bit, and you mentioned in the paper about the traditional view of fire alarm oversight versus cop on the beat oversight. Ken is interested in sort of reflecting upon the differences between those two. My dog's interested in this too, between routine and fire alarm oversight, and how that might factor into the effectiveness of oversight in reducing improper payments.
I mean, I'll just quickly say that it does seem like, even if it was a fire alarm that generated these hearings, the conversation between the members and the witnesses really is much more proactive police patrol type stuff, which is, okay, what resources can Congress provide? What connections can Congress help you make? So again, like reading the transcripts for what they are, it does sort of seem to me that it is more of a proactive police patrol setting. Now, as Joe mentioned, this is a less salient issue. You're not going to have a Benghazi hearing. I mean, I suppose you could have a GSA type hearing, but certainly in this setting, it does seem like proactive planning type relationships are available.
Well, that's maybe a great way to end. I mean, there's so much more we could get into here. One thing we didn't really talk about, but we, maybe in the future, is something, Joe, I think you suggested, which is that the nature of the programs really can have an influence on how much opportunity there is to reduce improper payments, right? One of the assumptions here, I think, was that sort of even though you had data on a lot of different programs, the effectiveness of oversight may be greater in some instances, and in some cases, there were significant reductions in improper payments, and that raises the question of, like, well, maybe there's not a lot more that can be done, to reduce payments in some of these programs and some of these agencies. Well, we have to wrap this up, and I want to turn things over to my colleague to open up the next panel. But before doing that, let me thank Pamela and Seth for providing a really, really insightful and very interesting paper. Let me thank Joe for doing a terrific job reviewing it and really inspiring a really, really interesting conversation. So thank you all. Now I'm going to turn things over to Ben Ike, who is manager of our state training and development program at the State Oversight Academy. Ben, take it away, introduce our next panel, and thank you all.
Thanks, Jim. And wow, I mean, what a great way to start this State Oversight Academy Symposium. What a great conversation. Thank you all for such an informative and engaging presentation, and for the whole discussion, the Q&A. Truly, just such an impressive group of people that are here today. So thank you again. I'd like to transition us now to the second paper. Second paper is titled, Can Institutional Reform Protect Election Certification? Your two authors are Professor Dan Butler, Professor of Political Science at Washington University in St. Louis. He studies state politics and primary elections. His most recent book is Rejecting Compromise, Legislators' Fear of Primary Voters, published at the Cambridge University Press. With him is also Professor Jeff Harden. He's an Andrew McKenna Family Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. His research agenda focuses on political representation, public policy diffusion, and state politics. His most recent book is The Illusion of Accountability, Transparency and Representation in American Legislatures, published in 2022 in Cambridge. If Professor Butler and Professor Harden are on, I will transition right over so they can begin their presentation.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. My name is Dan Butler, and as was said, I'm at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm presenting for Jeff, well, for both of us. Obviously, Jeff is also here. Today, we want to talk about oversight of elections in the form of election certification. Now, our motivation comes from the pressure that elected officials sometimes face for overturning elections that are free and fair. Today, we're going to argue that we'd like to argue that it's incentive compatible for politicians to give that oversight responsibility. That is the responsibility for certifying elections to a nonpartisan commission. Now, by incentive compatible, I simply mean that it is in the politician's own interest, electoral interest, to give the power of that certification process to a nonpartisan commission. As I noted at the beginning, our motivation is to avoid a case where a free election is being overturned, simply because this type of election subversion threatens democracy. Here are 3 ways that we might avoid having elected officials act to overturn a free and fair election. We could think about the selection mechanism, or the process by which who runs for office, who gets elected. This is an important question, but it's not something we're going to talk about here. A second thing is we could look instead at shaping the incentives that politicians face. So we could work on persuasion by trying to convince voters to kind of support free and fair elections, in which case there would not be the same kind of electoral incentive or pressure to act in a way detrimental. Again, this is an important avenue of research, but not what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to focus on the last solution given on the slide, insulation. Now, by insulation, we want to separate politicians from the process. Basically, we want to give them political cover for not acting to try to subvert an election. Now, why would this insulation help? Politicians have incentives to win re-election, which they do by catering to the preferences of voters in key elections, which include their primary electorate. To win re-election, politicians act to earn credit with voters and to act to avoid being blamed by them. So if politicians don't act to attack an election result when voters want them to attack that result, they face this potential backlash from those voters. Nonpartisan commissions provide cover or insulation. Elected officials can say that it is truly out of their hands. In this way, we argue that a nonpartisan commissions insulate politicians from these pressures and has the nice, sad benefit of insulating the process as well. So our argument is that nonpartisan commissions are an incentive compatible because it provides this insulation. Now, what I'm going to present to you today is some initial research that we set out to test whether this is true. Is it the case that commissions provide cover? Now, remember, we are interested in how voters who don't think an election is free and fair respond depending on who certifies an election, right? We really care whether you take the certification out of the hands of politicians and put it into the hands of the commission. Does that affect how these kind of voters respond? Why are we focusing on these voters? Well, if all voters thought an election was free and fair, there would be no need to insulate the politicians because they wouldn't have this pressure from voters. So in our survey, we needed to identify the voters who might kind of exert this pressure on politicians. Now, this is the question we used in the survey to identify those voters. We asked them about their feelings regarding the 2020 presidential election. We do not use, you notice there was 3 responses, which are listed here on the screen. We're not going to use the respondents who said they thought that the election was free and fair. We are going to use people who respond to one of the other 2 ways, which I've highlighted in red. It wasn't highlighted in red for the record when we ran the survey. Now, this includes people who said, we do not yet know who truly won the election. Even more investigations are needed. We gave this option to respondents as a way to avoid kind of social desirability bias, keeping people from expressing doubts that they might otherwise express or convey to politicians. Because saying the election was stolen is not always, socially desirable. And so we wanted to give this option. Now, in our survey, 30% of respondents gave one of these 2. They chose one of these last 2 options on the bottom of the screen. Now, our survey was conducted by the National Opinion Research Center, NORC, earlier this year. Overall in the survey, we had 1,000 respondents, and we're going to focus on those 314 respondents who did not choose the option that they thought the election was free and fair. Now, we gave these 314 respondents a vignette describing a hypothetical news story. The news story described the certification of an election. In the vignette, the election was always certified. And the news story always talked about the Secretary of State. We varied two pieces of information in the story. And those treatments are listed on the right side of your screen. The first, treatment one, was what position the Secretary of State took, either that the election was free and fair or that they thought the election was stolen. Second, we varied whether the Secretary of State certified the election or whether a nonpartisan commission certified the election. Thus, we have a total of 4 potential treatments, 4 potential kind of vignettes that people saw, and reflecting the combinations that you get by varying these 2 dimensions. At the end, we always ask them how much they approve of the Secretary of State described in the vignette. Here are the results. Here, we're estimating the difference between the 3 conditions you see listed, or in other words, these versions of the vignette that we gave, and the baseline version. Now, the baseline version was the Secretary of State saying the election was stolen, but then they went on themselves to certify it. So compared to that condition. Positive values mean that voters had more approval for that Secretary of State. Negative values meant they had less. The red vertical line marks where the difference in the outcome, how much they approve of the Secretary of State, if that difference is 0, difference from this baseline condition. Now you see those top 2, the confidence interval overlaps with that line. It means that we are not observing a statistically significant difference between those conditions and the baseline condition. The only version of the vignette that is statistically significant from the other versions is where the Secretary of State says the election was stolen, but a nonpartisan commission is the one that then goes on to certify it. When the Secretary of State takes that position with voters, but isn't the one to certify, they do get credit with voters. By contrast, if the Secretary of State takes a different position than voters want by saying the election was free and fair, or acts in a way that indicates they thought the election was free and fair, they don't get that same benefit from voters. Now, for the cases where the outcome of the election is certified, the politician does better with voters when they are not empowered to certify the elections, when they are insulated from the process, when that decision is out of their hands. This is our main takeaway. Non-partisan commissions insulate politicians and the process. The great part here, there's broad support for this. So in that same survey, we asked voters whether they would prefer using non-partisan commissions in the election process. Now, the question we asked is on your left side of your screen. They could choose, we asked them, who do you prefer to oversee elections in your state? And they could either choose partisan officials or a nonpartisan appointed commission. Again, I'm highlighting it in red. It was not highlighted in red when they read this, right? We were not trying to drive them to this. The results given on the right side show there's a clear consensus across all groups of partisans and across different attitudes regarding the 2020 election. About 3/4 of voters prefer to have a nonpartisan commission in charge. So there's widespread support for this. Jeff and I acknowledge there's a potential downside here. Our proposed solution creates a moral hazard problem. If politicians are not in charge of the process, they might decide to attack free and fair elections to earn points with voters. However, we think the benefits outweigh that cost. Recall, this is only an issue if lots of voters want to overturn a free and fair election. In that case, they're going to have incentives not just to use the rhetoric, they're going to have incentives to actually overturn it. This solution protects the process in a way that also aligns with politicians' interest. We view this, the relevant analogy for us is seatbelts. When you require people to use seatbelts, some drivers are going to drive faster and more recklessly because they're safer if they get into an accident. And yet, seatbelts are absolutely the right answer because they save lives. We view this proposal as a seatbelt for democracy. Even if it leads some politicians to act more recklessly, the beneficial protection it provides to democracy outweighs that cost. In summary, we propose that giving nonpartisan commissions the power to certify elections is better for democracy and better for politicians, and it has broad support from all groups of voters. So, in summary, we should do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Butler. I really appreciate the presentation. It's a fascinating paper. I really enjoyed reading it. At this time, I would like to invite the reviewing practitioner, Cade Minchie. Cade is the Utah Legislative Auditor General and Director of the Office of the Legislative Auditor General. In 2018, Cade was appointed by the Speaker, Senate President, and both bodies of the Utah Legislature to be the Auditor General. Cade has worked on a broad range of performance audits in his career that include favoritism and nepotism within the Department of Corrections, fraud, waste, and abuse in the state's Medicaid program, and regulatory and tax concerns on radioactive waste within the Department of Environmental Quality. Cade, all you.
Thanks, Ben. Excited to be here today. This is a real fun opportunity for me. Fascinating paper that I get to respond to. The elections and the safety and security elections is huge to all of us. And I appreciate the work of these two great professors in diving into this issue and really bringing up, I think, some real insightful and meaningful ideas for conversation. I'm going to approach this, of course, my role here is to approach it from a practitioner's viewpoint. And so I'm going to bring up that side of it. And I think there's some real good overlap there, but there's maybe a little bit of separation as well. I will maybe just say to start out with that on our side, I know at least in Utah, when I say our side, that there has been a lot of issues with the legislature when it comes to what they believe representative democracy is and how their role is in that space. But that, not having said that, the issues of commissions do come up from time to time, and we have dealt with some of those and used some of those here in the state. I'm going to start out first by talking a little bit about our work with election integrity, specifically in the state of Utah. It was a question that came up, I think, nationwide, but certainly in the state of Utah it came up. There were several individuals that were concerned, and rightly so. The integrity of elections is critical and should be safely guarded and should be well understood and researched. And so the legislature turned to our office to do a review on it. We did a very comprehensive review, and we'll put some links here onto the chat for first our audit that we did on election integrity. What we found is that there was no widespread fraud issues and that our election system was generally secure, which was, I think, very reassuring. However, we go on for, I can't remember, 5 or 6 chapters and talk about a number of issues that could be improved within the election system. And that report will detail all those. I won't necessarily go into all of those right now for the sake of time and for the sake of simplicity, other than to say a lot of what the issues we found was consistency across the state. It wasn't necessarily to say that one county or another county was doing things necessarily poorly. It was that there were diverging ways of having election controls, and we felt like there was a lot of benefit in systematizing that or making it more consistent across the the state, which in Utah, it's the lieutenant governor that is over elections. And so there was some more authority given to that office in statute to help with that consistency across all counties. Now, there were some counties that clearly did elections better than others, for sure. Some of those were larger counties, and larger counties need to have better systems and process and controls in place because of the volume of the ballots that they receive. But that's not to say the smaller counties shouldn't ensure that this is done well. And that was, again, what some of the recommendations were around. I can tell you that in Utah, that audit that we did was taken extremely seriously, and that every one of our recommendations was put into a bill, a House bill that was passed, I believe unanimously. I may be wrong with that by that, but it was mostly unanimous and was put into law and has been in effect. Another thing that happened also in our state as dealing about what should be the process to ensure that election integrity and security is handled and the citizens of the state can trust that elections are secure and safe, which is what I think is really being talked about here. One thing that Utah decided to do was to empower my office to do audits on every federal election cycle. So we are going to be involved every 2 years in auditing the election system and ensuring that it is safe and secure. And hopefully that will provide some additional surety for those in the state that elections are being done well. Let me talk just a minute about kind of governance. And I bring this up from if a commission or any organization is created, again, I'm speaking from a practitioner's view and someone that audits the integrity of systems across the state. Governance is such a critical issue for any organization, regardless of how it's formed. And what we see quite often is governance not set up quite the way that we would like to see it set up. We have a best practice handbook that the link is there. But, I think a good definition of governance is, let's see, I got it right here. I wanted to read it. It refers to the structure, actions, and processes of the highest leadership level of any organization. And so if we were going to set up a commission from a practitioner's viewpoint, I'd just like to make sure that the governance was set up in a way that the integrity of that system and structure was well established. And let me just kind of explain what I mean by that. We have systems that are governed by boards or commissions. And sometimes those boards and commissions, unfortunately, aren't doing their job to the highest level what we would like to see them do. And I'll give an example of that. Our Utah system of higher education. There's been a number of audits that we have done on that system over the years. And so this is all well known and public, everything I'm going to say here. But that system, unfortunately, over the years has been more of a rubber stamp than a real oversight and control board. And so if we were going to set up a system of a commission over elections, we want to make sure that that didn't happen there, because the reverse happens when governance isn't correct, is that citizens not gain trust, but they actually lose trust in the system. There was a number of audits, like I said, that we did to try to help in that space. And it wasn't that these weren't well-intentioned and good people. That's not the case at all. These were all very qualified individuals on this board. And we didn't see any ethical lapses that was occurring by anyone in this board. It was just that they would come for a few hours once a month. They would get reports from the Commissioner of Higher Education and others, and they just didn't have really the time or capacity to look in to how to review properly and accurately the governance of a very large system with hundreds of millions of dollars. Another example of that was our Utah Transit Authority, which we audited a number of years ago. It was the same issue. A very well-intentioned board, very, I'd say competent and qualified individuals on that board. But once again, they would come, the leadership of the transit organization would give them information, they'd review it, they'd look at it, they'd approve it, they'd go on. Unfortunately, when we came and audited that group, what we found is that none of that information going to the board was accurate. Control audit function wasn't catching much of the inaccurate information. And there were some real issues that were extremely concerning. The legislature changed the governance of that board of UTA and made it a 3-member full-time commission, and that we're now back auditing that transit authority in the state of Utah. The findings of that are not finished, and so I can't talk about them publicly, but I will say that the organization is much better run now. So just in maybe conclusion for my points on this, again, I'm kind of hopefully not straying around here too much, but in the governance section, I would just say that in Utah, we really are trying to take this very seriously. And that best practice handbook that we talked, that is a link there, is an effort in our state to say, I always say this comment when I go and meet with groups. It may not have the same effect here in this group because most people's microphones are muted, which is fine and appropriate. But I will say we're the auditors and we're here to help. And then there's just laughter, right? I see some smiles, but there's just laughter whenever I say that. In fact, I was doing a training conference yesterday to a group of special service districts, and they almost laughed me out of the room. But then I'm able to demonstrate to them that I really mean that. And the way that I mean that is this best practice handbook. We are giving organizations, this is what we're going to look at. This is not a gotcha approach. We're not here. I don't take any great pleasure in coming in and saying, oh, wow, you caught you doing something wrong. Let's write it up and report. That's not what our office is about. That's not what we do. What we want is just good controls and good systems. So we've written a whole handbook that gives everything we're going to look at. And there's no secrets or surprises. Here's what we're looking for. And I think that has hopefully been a good approach. That handbook's only been out for less than a year, but I talked to a national conference about this for my peers across the state. It was very well received that a lot of auditors think that's a good approach. So again, on election integrity, if a commission oversight board was to be put in place, I would just urge any organization or state that was looking at doing that to ensure that they put the governance in place in a solid and a practical way. And with that, Ben, I'm thankful for the opportunity and turn it back for any questions.
Okay, and I would also, you are an auditor and you are here to help, and I'm very thankful that you did help with the SOA Symposium. So thank you for your presentation feedback. Professor Butler, Professor Harden, anything you wish to kind of ask Kate before I switch over to Q&A?
I don't think I understand. Academia is supposed to not figure out how to actually do things. We're just supposed to tell other people how to do them and then let them do it. No, this is such a great suggestion, and it's not. And for those who haven't read the paper, this is not something we delve into the paper. I think the closest analogy out there is independent redistricting commissions, right? And so I think there are some places we can look to for examples on how to do this, and also how to actually get it implemented. Which, if that's of interest, I'm happy to talk more about. But absolutely. I love that, and maybe when we do that research, we'll come and talk to you, make sure we're on the right track.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, at this moment, I have just a couple of questions here that I'd like to share. One that I was really interested in, I'm thinking a little bit about the sampling process that happened here. From our position in the State Oversight Academy, a difficulty that's been expressed to me by professors all across the country has been traditionally more kind of election fraud, or even just generally speaking, more people that see themselves as more right-wing have not been participating in a lot of these samples and a lot of these surveys. What was different this time around? I mean, 314 checking those, either one of those two responses, that stuck out to me. Do you really have any inclination as to what was the secret recipe here?
I wish Jeff may have an answer. We can't really take the credit because we're not the ones running this particular, recruiting the sample. I do think it mattered that we asked the question in a way that allowed them to not be cornered, right? To say, you either think it was free and fair or you think it was stolen, right? Because I think there would be a lot of people who would say, oh, I don't, I know I'm not supposed to say it's stolen, but if you kind of gave this kind of ambiguous option, right? Which I think is also kind of, so that answer I think mattered, right? We were able to give them an answer they could reveal themselves with without feeling like And then the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago is just a good outfit. I mean, they've been polling for a long, long time. This is the high quality out. So those are my two quick responses. Yeah, great question. We were surprised we had that many, but we're grateful. Well, not grateful. That sounds the wrong way of saying it. From a statistical power analyzing the data, it made it, enough observations that we had could answer this question with that sample, but not grateful for it. That's the wrong word. Sorry.
No worries. Professor Strickland?
Thank you. Yeah, I found this very interesting. I had a quick question about the support for the nonpartisan commission. On that scale from Democrat to Republican, the results almost look symmetrical to me. 71% to 72% and independents like 68%. My question is, why do you think leaners, those who lean Republican, those who lean Democrat, were so much higher than independents? It seems a bit counterintuitive to me that maybe the independents would have less of a partisan connection. And the results are, like I said, symmetrical. Any idea what's going on?
I'm being silent, hoping Jeff will answer.
Yeah, I can weigh in on that. I mean, so James, the quick answer is the confidence intervals on all of those are going to be big enough that there may not actually be a difference. I don't believe we looked into that specifically, but I'm just confident knowing what the confidence intervals are. So I don't have much of an explanation, but if we collected more data and ran it again, I'd be interested to see if we still got that same pattern.
Thank you.
Seth Hill?
Thanks. This was really interesting, and I haven't read the paper, so I was a little curious. Thinking about Cade's comments, it does depend a little bit how the nonpartisan commission is populated, right? If this were an elected body, why would it be different than a nonpartisanly elected state auditor with respect to its reputation and authority? And if it's not populated through election, how do you I know how the Citizen Districting Commission in California is populated, but it seems like there is a bit of a rollback recursive problem, which is you might claim this commission is nonpartisan, but when I look to see how it was populated, it was the California legislature who put it together. So I'm still not going to trust the results. So and I kind of think, Cade has an interesting point, which is, as the auditor, he has a reputation for auditing a whole host of things beyond simply elections, and he can draw upon that authority in issuing a report on elections that perhaps a nonpartisan commission that was only tasked with certifying elections wouldn't have access to.
So,
go ahead,
please. You first.
I can start us on that. I think it is a really important. Thanks, Seth. It's an important question, and the redistricting commissions that we talk a little bit about in the paper have had varying success on exactly this question. So it is true that how you put together a nonpartisan commission matters a whole lot, because it matters for the reaction that voters have to that group. So, we have not done any research on what would make the most sense, but we do have some ideas that I think would be worth testing. So one that Dan and I have talked about is somehow defining a pool of people who would qualify, something like retired judges, for example, and then using a lottery system to pick the members. And also probably there would be some sort of term component. So you would only be on the commission for some number of elections or some number of years or something like that. So in general, I think our best thought is that if we can disconnect the selection process from any one election or any one set of political events, the better, because that's what's going to create that insulation that Dan was talking about. So something like a lottery sounds appealing to me, at least certainly for political scientists wanting to study the effect of a commission, that would be great. But I think from the perspective of the trust that voters have in the commission. That's important too. We do know from the work on redistricting commissions that if it is simply the legislature picking, people don't see that as a nonpartisan commission.
I was going to answer too a little bit, Ben, if that's okay. So we made a choice in terms of the alternative being a nonpartisan commission, in part because that's when we looked across what we thought was most realistic at the time, that seemed like the most realistic option as an alternative, right? Kind of honestly looking to independent redistricting commissions, honestly. But you make an interesting point, right? What if it's just, could it be someone else who somehow, is nonpartisan, but not a commission, right? And one of the things I like about what you suggested, which I need to think more about, is this element of, can they build a reputation over multiple things, which allows them to then to have more authority in this space. I think that's a really interesting consideration. And this, speaking to Jeff's point, we had been, to the extent that we had thought about something, we'll add this to the list of things to consider, right? We had been thinking about maybe there should be a sunset provision, how long you serve on this committee, but maybe to this point, Jeff, maybe, thinking out loud in front of everyone here with Jeff, like maybe it's these, elected judges or whoever it is, maybe they serve overlapping. So there's always at least some continuity. So if you were happy with the last time, you can always point and say, hey, the same, 2/3 of this commission was there last time and they certified that election and you were okay with that, right? So you could have some sort of, not quite the same level of reputation building, but maintain some of that. The other interesting thing is, since I'll jump into with this, is that the other thing is, like, how would you actually get this on, like, passed? I think this is one where legislators might pass it themselves, right? Kind of think about, for the political scientists in the room, we all read a book when we were in grad school that talked about the bipartisan, no, not bipartisan, it's the Base Closure and Relocation Act. And the story behind the Base Closure and Relocation Act way back in the day was that when they needed to close Army bases and other military bases, but whenever they tried to, whoever was from that district would rally, right? And get their supporters to prevent them from, so they were having all this excess. At least this is the story that we all read. And the way they got around that is they just said, we're just gonna have an up or down vote. So we're gonna give it an independent commission or our subset, and they're gonna make a decision. I shouldn't say independent. We're gonna give it to a subset of people, and it's gonna be an up or down vote. So those people could then still decry this decision and say, I couldn't do anything about it, right? And so there's an element here. So having said that, I think the more realistic way of getting this through, it is possible legislators might implement this reform. More likely, it's going to be through the ballot initiative, right? If this is going to be implemented, it's probably through the ballot initiative. And I don't know which would, so there's an element of both what's best in practice and also what would voters support, which are both interesting questions.
Thank you all. Thank you all for a great paper, great discussion. And at this time, I would like to pass it over to the State Oversight Academy's Ian McKnight. Ian, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ben. I am Ian McKnight. I'm a state training and development manager alongside Ben at the State Oversight Academy. I have a political science degree, and I've been working for my entire working life in the orbit of state legislatures, in legislative institutions, in vendors for legislative institutions, and now for the Levin Center. So I have to say how much I have enjoyed these last two discussions and watching how we bridge the gap between academia and practitioners. It's a really exciting place to be and part of the real joy of the Levin Center. We have one more paper and one more discussion this afternoon, and I think we are in for a real treat to wrap things up. Our final paper comes from James Strickland. He's an associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. His areas of research include interest groups, legislatures, and state politics in the United States. And in his research, Professor Strickland examines the effects of institutions or laws on lobbyists. These include term limits, regulations on lobbying, and campaign finance laws. Today, we're going to hear about his paper, why hospitals hire tobacco lobbyists, conflicts of interest, and conflicts of interest among lobbying clients. And then we'll hear from Dr. David Orentliker later. But for now, Dr. Strickland, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Ian, for the kind introduction. And just for disclosure, I am an assistant professor, so not associate at this point. So I will share my screen and I will start from the beginning. So you should see this title screen at this point. First, I'd like to thank the Levin Center, the staff and leadership for having this symposium, and also to thank Representative David Orentliker for offering feedback on this paper. My co-author, Naimisha Chakravartinula, and I really look forward to having a great conversation. So the title of our paper is Why Hospitals Hire Tobacco Lobbyists. And in this paper, Naimisha and I are interested in understanding why interest groups hire lobbyists who represent seeming adversarial interests. That is, why do we see these conflicts of interest occur, it appear, within the clienteles of registered lobbyists? So we're not suggesting that any lobbyist cannot represent a set of adversarial interests. We're not here to prove any sort of corruption. Rather, we think it's interesting that hospitals may hire tobacco lobbyists. Dentists may hire candy or lobbyists who represent candy distributors on occasion. In lobbying, you often see a lot of strange examples of within the clienteles of multi-client advocates. So why would an interest group hire a lobbyist who represents someone who very well could represent the other side? Or why would there be a seeming conflict of interest? Now, previous research does suggest a few avenues for this. It does suggest that conflicts occur. Hospitals actually regularly hire tobacco lobbyists, hundreds of times actually, in a study back in the 90s. And we understand that multi-client lobbying is more prevalent than it has been pretty much ever at this point at the state level and within Congress. So there's a lot more potential for conflicts to occur. Lobbyists may have to watch or pay more attention to who they are representing. And conflicts can, hypothetically, undermine the representation of an individual client. So a textbook example that many of us may have heard of from about 15 years ago, Jack Abramoff, he was a lobbyist in Congress, and he actually lobbied against the interests of the client so that he could be paid to continue to lobby. So that he would be paid by the client to keep lobbying. We're not here, again, to suggest that there is corruption, but there are these potential risks of harm. So our theory about what explains these conflicts is that there are acceptable levels of risk that interest groups are willing to accept in order to get their message across to legislators. So there's a legal scholar, McMoneagle, who argues that you may have conflicts among attorneys. Some defendants may find it profitable. They may save money by hiring the same attorney and splitting costs, but there is a potential harm that the attorney could favor one client or the other. Again, it's just a risk. There's not necessarily the actual harm that's occurring to client interests. Lobbyists may balance those interests well. But keeping that risk in mind, some lobbyists can balance competing interests. What the clients, we expect them to do is weigh the risk of harm with the benefit of hiring individual lobbyists. So in other words, these interest groups are going to consider, are we okay with the risk of harm that hiring this lobbyist could present? Are we okay, if we are a hospital, are we okay with hiring a tobacco lobbyist? And what we test within this paper is that there are levels of risk acceptance that vary by group type and by the political and legal context. So we will show, for example, that anti-conflict laws actually matter for how often hospitals hire tobacco lobbyists. To give you an example of this, this is a web page from the American College of Radiology. And the college here is encouraging the local chapters to consider a number of factors when hiring a lobbyist, including the other clients that the lobbyist represents. The college indicates that some lobbyists may represent tobacco growers and competing healthcare interests as well. And so these are factors that a local chapter should consider when hiring and managing a contract lobbyist, often a multi-client lobbyist. So according to our theory or our view, membership groups and groups with donors have more to lose from harm. So, for example, on occasion, newspaper journalists members of the press will interview the healthcare clients, and they will ask, why did you hire a tobacco lobbyist? And the membership groups tend to express the greatest concern and cancel those contracts with the tobacco lobbyists more often. Why is that? Because there's a reputational harm. These organizations rely on members and donors who give or donate voluntarily, and there could be concerns that those donations or the time is not being used effectively, or that the donations are being paid indirectly to fund the other side. And so what we expect is that among membership-based groups or purposive groups, American Cancer Society, American Lung Association, the Diabetes Association, that these voluntary groups have more to lose than economic groups. Like I said, whenever various healthcare groups have been interviewed, responses vary. So the leader of a membership health group, when confronted with the fact that they had hired a tobacco lobbyist, said the fact that the lobbyist represents a tobacco company will be problematic for us. Versus the response of a health insurance group, we simply hire the lobbyists we feel are most effective in carrying our message to the legislative bodies. So we're starting to get some idea that maybe there are different levels of risk acceptance by group type. Now, the political and legal context should matter, and we use these to propose a few hypotheses. We think that competition for personal access to legislators may increase risk acceptance. So going back to the quote from the health insurance executive, the executive indicated that they hired lobbyists who can simply get the message across. If there's greater competition to get the message across, greater competition for meetings, in other words, if there are more interest groups per legislator on average, then we're expecting that to overall nudge up the susceptibility to risk, that is to hire lobbyists who may have conflicts. And reporting requirements as well may increase risk acceptance because interest groups can monitor better what their agents are doing. And importantly, roughly 7 states have what are known as anti-conflict laws. These are laws that require lobbyists to inform clients of a possible conflict and to receive written authorization that they may continue to represent them. So these are new laws. 1 or 2 states had them in the 1970s. The bulk of these laws were enacted over the past 10 to 15 years, however, with the law in Colorado being the newest law, I think. And so these laws may actually have an effect. They may discourage interest groups from hiring conflicted lobbyists because they simply have more information. So how do we test this? We have original data. We measure how often healthcare groups hired lobbyists who also represented tobacco interest groups within the states. We chose healthcare and tobacco because this set of interests appear to have the most diametrically opposed interests of all of those we could imagine, other than some ideological groups, of course. And generally, we consider the number of tobacco lobbyists hired per healthcare group as a proxy for risk acceptance, but not proof of harm. Again, we're not accusing any lobbyists of actually engaging in unethical behavior. And American states, as our venues, have variation in group types and political context. So like I've said, 7 states have anti-conflict laws. And so we're looking at all of the healthcare interests registered to lobby in nearly every state for 1989 and 2009, which is roughly 10,000 group state year observations. Now, we do have more data than this. If I were to show you all of the data we have, well, not even all the data we have, but all the data we've coded, we've actually seen that tobacco lobbying and healthcare lobbying really started to increase in the 1970s and 80s. And if we look at health firms with conflicts, this became quite common by the 1980s. We had 300 healthcare groups across the country, at least in 49 states, hire tobacco lobbyists, at least one tobacco lobbyist. So we're going to perform a series of statistical analyses to find evidence for our theory, to test our hypotheses. The unit of analysis, as mentioned, that's the health group per state and year. The dependent variable here, number of tobacco lobbyists hired. We are going to control for total lobbyists per group, total tobacco groups within the state, and state and year effects. And we also have as variables of interest the group type. Healthcare groups are classified as occupational membership, advocacy membership, or other. And this other would include hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. Groups per legislator to measure competition, anti-conflict law, and reporting requirements. And we estimate a series of regression models. So we begin with 2 negative binomial models since we're working with a count outcome variable. We also have 2 zero-inflated regressions. We had 1 state in our sample where there were no tobacco groups registered to lobby. So it's just impossible for there to be conflicts here according to our measurement. And some models include interactive terms. And all of the other specifications, other than the interactive terms, remain the same. So let's start with the group level differences. If we look at the very top of table 2 in the paper, these are group level variables. And what this is measuring across all 4 models is whether occupational membership groups and advocacy groups hire different numbers of tobacco lobbyists from healthcare institutions like hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. And what we find is that there is a discernible difference in the tobacco lobbyist hiring trends between advocacy groups like the American Lung Association, American Cancer Society, and hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. And the trend is found across all 4 models, and these are not least squares coefficients. So to interpret these, what we're finding essentially is that these advocacy groups hire between 54 and 74% fewer tobacco lobbyists on average. If we go further down the table and we look at interstate differences, we find mostly consistent evidence that competition, that is number of groups in the state divided by legislators, contributes to these the hiring of tobacco lobbyists. But in my opinion, one of the most interesting findings we have, and which may interest the audience here, is that anti-conflict laws are correlated with healthcare groups hiring fewer tobacco lobbyists. And so if we were to interpret these coefficients, these anti-conflict laws reduced the hiring of tobacco lobbyists by 60 to 75%, depending on the model in the states where they were implemented. And we do find some evidence that the more reports there are within the state, the more conflicts, or the more often healthcare groups hire tobacco lobbyists. And of course, we've controlled for tobacco groups in all 4 models. Tobacco groups is towards the bottom in the zero-inflated models. So this is interesting, but we need one other set of analysis. Why? Because tobacco lobbyists tend to be multi-client advocates. And it may simply be the case that these healthcare groups who hire multi-client advocates are hiring tobacco lobbyists by accident. In other words, how do we know we're not capturing a group's propensity to hire multi-client lobbyists? So we need to control for that. And we also need to control for salary as well. So we look at a smaller sample of states from 2018 where the salaries, or the amount of compensation that each lobbyist, that every lobbyist receives from each client, is reported and easily usable. We look at those 5 states to see if the trends persist. And looking at these 5 states, a smaller sample also allows us to compare tobacco hiring among non-healthcare groups to see if healthcare groups are actually any different from non-healthcare groups. So in the second set of analyses, what we find, in this first set, we're going to replicate our results from earlier using the smaller sample size of about 600 groups from the 5 states in 2018. And we find the same thing, that advocacy groups are different from the institutional interests, as well as occupational groups, after controlling for the log number of lobbyists. If we were to control for numbers of multi-client lobbyists and how much compensation is included, we continue to find the same difference. Advocacy groups appear to shy away from tobacco lobbyists. Now, if we look at all of the interest groups within a state, within the 5 states, what we then find is that there's actually no difference between the tobacco, how often healthcare groups hire tobacco lobbyists and how often other groups hire tobacco lobbyists. It's not statistically discernible. It's negative, but just not at a traditional level. But if we break this difference down by institution, healthcare institution occupancy, and advocacy, we do find that health advocacy groups hire fewer tobacco lobbyists than all of the other groups within a state. But health institutions, so your hospitals, your pharmaceutical companies, as well as your large occupational groups like the American College of Radiology, there's no difference. They're all hiring tobacco lobbyists just like any other interest group would. So what are the findings here? We find consistent support for intergroup differences among healthcare interests. Those health advocacy groups really shy away from tobacco lobbyists. We also find support that interstate differences persist, that the more groups there are clamoring for legislator time, the more conflicts there appear to be, the more tobacco lobbyists are hired. But that importantly, anti-conflict laws can actually help to improve representation if we think that these conflicts are a problem. And reporting may actually encourage the risk. So what are the implications? I'll conclude here briefly. Despite the decline of tobacco use and the 1998 master settlement, tobacco lobbyists are now more numerous than ever at the state level, and conflicts are more frequent as well. Although groups do try to minimize risk of harm, as we found, many accept the risk because they face seemingly minimal consequences. It's important to note that the true cost of hiring a tobacco lobbyist may never be known for a healthcare group. So it's really difficult to monitor what agents are doing. We may not know if an agent is lobbying against the interests of the healthcare group. And so it's really difficult for me to say how big of a problem this is for representation broadly or for the representation of a single client. But if we do think it may be a problem, then perhaps an anti-conflict law may help. Large assemblies and anti-conflict laws may improve representation of interests generally by decreasing conflicts, but we need to look at interest groups other than healthcare groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Strickland, and that was absolutely excellent. As a reminder, if you have questions, we invite you to add them to the Q&A section here in Zoom. And I want to turn things over now to our final reviewing practitioner this afternoon, David Orentlicher. He is the Judge Jack and Lulu Lehman Professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, William S. Boyd School of Law, and Director of the UNLV Health Law Program. Widely recognized for his expertise in health law and constitutional law, Dr. O has testified before Congress, had his scholarship cited by the Supreme Court, and has served on national, state, and local commissions. He's a graduate of Harvard Medical School and Harvard Law School, and we're not even to the best part yet. Dr. O is serving his second term in the Nevada Assembly, and from 2002 to 2008, he served 3 terms in the Indiana House of Representatives. You can see why we would be so excited to welcome Dr. O to the State Oversight Academy today to join us. He's also served as a health policy advisor to the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Dr. O, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. And and also for me to have a chance to participate and read this paper, because it's a very interesting and important research, both to me as a scholar and a legislator. And we see a good deal of attention to the concerns raised by relationships between lobbyists and elected or appointed officials. So it's very helpful to have research looking at the concerns raised by the relationship between lobbyists and clients. It's not something that my legislative colleagues and I think about. I don't think we give a lot of attention to. So it's important that there is research on this and raising the concerns. Nevada happens to be one of the states that requires lobbyists to report, as we heard all 50 states do. And we do require some disclosure of spending on lobbying activities, which I'll show. But we don't require the direct, the anti-conflict disclosures about to clients, which maybe we should. So I'm just going to illustrate a little bit what it looks like in Nevada, as you heard, and you can see. So these are screenshots. I just went to illustrate what we actually require. So this shows you, as we one of the more prominent lobbyists and all the clients, and I'm just going to enlarge this so you can see it better. But this lobbyist, and he's with he has his firm, and there are 3 leading partners. So he shares this responsibility. But one of the things I noticed, one is how many clients he and his colleagues have. But interestingly, he does illustrate nicely the concern, because one of his clients is Altria, right here. Altria, as you may know, is a company that has a lot of tobacco interests. Their big one is Philip Morris. Philip Morris, in turn, owns Marlboro. Marlboro, I found as I was doing my little looking around, has about a 42% market share among cigarette companies. By far, it's triple the number 2. It's number 1 market share in the US, triple its biggest competitor. So Altria, major tobacco company. But look, he also represents the Comprehensive Cancer Society of Nevada, which obviously you would think is a concern of the Comprehensive Cancer Society. He represents HCA Healthcare, which is Hospital Corporation of America, owns a lot of hospitals, GlaxoSmithKline Pharmaceutical. So this is a good example of somebody who represents a number of healthcare organizations and also a major tobacco company. So let me now get to some of, and I'll show you some other, just some other things about disclosure. So, right, you can easily find out, you look up your lobbyists, who they represent. But again, if you are a Comprehensive Cancer Center of Nevada, which is, as it suggests, these are doctors, oncologists who treat patients with cancer. If they want to find out who Rocky Finseth represents, they just can go on this website. We don't do much else. Here's another example of somebody who has a lot of partners and a lot of clients. I couldn't find any tobacco here. But what else do you get? The only other thing you really get if you want to now go. So I showed you Chelsea Capuro's stable of clients, which she shares with about 5 other lobbyists. What else do you learn about Chelsea Capuro? Not much. And this more goes to the relationship with legislators, how much she spent each month on during the session. This is session. We meet from start in February and go through May. And it's this. So what you can see is her expenditures. And notice they're all receptions. And that's all you see. And that's pretty typical. And then you'll see other lobbyists don't have anything. And the reason why you see those kind of numbers and reason and bases is, I don't know if it's a quirk, but it's a phenomenon of our laws. And that is lobbyists can't give us any gifts, but if they host a reception where everybody's invited, then they can do that. They can spend money on us that way. So that's what lobbyists do. They throw receptions, they can invite anybody, and then they report that. The other thing that's important about that, they're required actually to report the amount expenditure per legislator. You don't see that. You only see aggregates, and that's because when they do these receptions that every lobbyist every legislator is invited to, they don't have to break it down per legislator. They can just report the aggregate. So you can see we don't get much information about the lobbyist client relationship or lobbyist legislator relationship. Okay, so let me go back. So there's some, I'll make a few observations and questions. The difference between reporting requirements for potential conflicts, which seems to increase the assumption of risk, as James put it, and disclosure requirements, telling your client, I have these conflicts, is striking and important. As a legislator, reading this report has given me a much better sense of the need to address conflicts of interest between lobbyists and clients. As I say, it's not something I've thought about. I focus more on the lobbyist-legislator relationship. And it's important that if we're going to focus on this as legislators, that we address the problem of lobbyist conflicts effectively, because apparently in Nevada, we haven't done that so well. So it's important, it's helpful to know that most states, including Nevada, we should supplement our reporting requirements with the anti-conflicts law that the 7 states have that require lobbyists to notify clients of potential conflicts and receive written authorization to provide continued representation. But it's not surprising that the disclosure to clients and needing their sign off would have a bigger impact than reporting requirements. Just telling the legislature, our council bureau, we've got these conflicts. It's harder for a client to so I think maybe one of the explanations here, it's harder for a client to defend their tolerance of the conflict of interest when there's a paper record that they were advised about the conflict and they signed off on it. Interestingly, this anti-conflict example at 7 states, you got to notify your client and get their sign off. Interestingly, if the lobbyist is a lawyer, then the professional responsibility obligations of the lawyer would lead to the same kind of disclosure and sign off that some states require of all lobbyists. So I'll show you what it looks like. I'm going to have to shrink this one. This is from the ABA, American Bar Association's Model Code of Professional Conduct. This is Rule 1.7 that's widely adopted by states. And what it says is, if you're a lawyer not supposed to represent a client who creates a conflict of interest with another client, if your representation of one client will be directly adverse to another client, you're not supposed to do it. Or if there's significant risk that your representation of one client would be materially limited by your responsibilities to another client. So you read this and you think, how can we have lawyers serving as lobbyists, and there are many who are lawyers, doing these representations? And then you go to 1.7b, and turns out, well, you can actually enter these conflicted relationships if the lawyer believes they can provide competent and diligent representation. I doubt there are lawyers who would say, I can't do that. The representation is not prohibited by law. This 3 only applies if you're representing clients in courts or other tribunals. That wouldn't apply in the lobbying setting. And then 4 is the key, right? If the affected client gives informed consent, right? You disclose that you've got this conflicted representation, they confirm it in writing, then you're off the hook. So lawyer lobbyists have to do this in 50 states. Non-lawyer lobbyists only have to do this in 7 states, and makes me wonder whether it was lawyer lobbyists that pushed for these anti-conflict laws. Okay, but so we have these, so this is good. Oh, and I pulled the Colorado example, right? One of the anti-conflicts, you can't represent an adverse client without first obtaining consent of the client after full disclosure. So the laws that, if this is typical, the anti-conflict laws follow the model, professional responsibility rule, but only to the extent of B4. They don't require B1, 2, or 3. It's just B4. But there it is. But it is disappointing that reporting requirements seem to have the opposite impact of what you would hope in their association, right? We see a greater retention of conflicted lobbyists. I would like to say this association is surprising, but it seems consistent with studies on physician conflicts of interest. Studies there have shown that having disclosed conflicts, if you're a physician, you disclose your conflicts, maybe you have an investment interest, you have royalties on a device that you use in surgery, you invest in, or you have a consulting relationship with a pharmaceutical company, disclosing your conflicts of interest to your patients may actually make physicians more comfortable acting on their conflicts. So it's right, they feel kind of virtuous. I disclose, so now I'm okay. So it's possible the reporting requirements make lobbyists feel freer to take on clients with conflicting interests. What about the concern that that client conflicts may lead to actual harm, right? The study doesn't show that, but conflicts in others involving experimental subjects serving in an advisory role. This is some work that has been done looking, it could be a physician advisor, could be a lawyer advisor, could be a financial advisor. So some experimental studies with experimental subjects have found that advisors have been shown to sometimes increase the bias in their advice with after they've disclosed, either strategically because they anticipate that the recipient will discount their advice, or via a process called moral licensing, where they feel less guilt in giving biased advice because they've made a disclosure. So we should worry that the reporting requirement and the disclosure requirements might embolden lobbyists to act on their conflicts in ways that are harmful to their clients. The other thing that if you look at the physician conflicts of interest literature, I don't think is as relevant as here, is they call what's called insinuation anxiety. A doctor says to the patient, I have these conflicts, don't worry, your best interests are my priority. But how is the patient going to react? Maybe they're concerned if the physician is going to use the device for their hip replacement and they get royalties from that hip, that artificial hip. And what we see there is that sometimes the potential concern is that patients worry about offending their doctor. They might have wanted to do a second opinion, but now that the doctor has told them about a conflict, they might worry that asking for a second opinion will suggest they don't trust the doctor. That may be less of a concern in the lobbyist-client relationship. You don't have the power imbalance I don't think, in most lobbyist clients than you do with doctors and patients. One of the things I wonder about were some of the healthcare clients less sensitive to the potential conflict of interest because they didn't see a real conflict. So I'm going to be a little cynical here. That is, as we saw, while the advocacy groups respond negatively to the conflict and don't hire these lobbyists who have tobacco interests, healthcare groups like hospitals and doctor groups that have a mission to promote the health of their patients, their economic interests often will align with those of tobacco companies. If you're treating lung cancer and people are smoking, you get more patients who need your care. I know I'm being cynical here, but we know that people respond, doctors included, to their personal economic interests. So unfortunately, hospitals and physicians often gain financially when people are sick and need healthcare. This reality may help explain why the healthcare groups that are more sensitive to the tobacco are the advocacy groups, the not-for-profit advocacy group organizations, such as the Cancer Society and Lung Association. I also wonder about another variable that might affect the willingness of healthcare groups to tolerate the conflicts of interest raised by lobbyists who represent tobacco industry, right? As we heard, they want more effective lobbyists, and that makes sense. So they're balancing benefits and risks. One thing that I'm curious about whether this would make a difference. Many lobbyists are former legislators and likely are perceived as being able to leverage that status in their lobbying. So I wonder if looking at that variable, whether the lobbyist is a former legislator or not, would show any effect. I'm not sure, because so many lobbyists are former legislators, so it's not clear you get enough numbers. But I'd be interested if that's been looked at and what you would find. And then finally, in thinking about translating this research findings into policy, I would love to hear more about your recommendations for legislative proposals. Your findings indicate that my colleagues and I should prefer anti-conflict requirements over reporting requirements. So that's something I'm going to go back at our next session in 2025. Are there model versions of these requirements that we should consider? Also, are there ways to improve the reporting requirements so they have a positive effect? And finally, should some conflicts be prohibited? I think that American College of Radiology slide you showed mentioned that there are some states that prohibit conflicts. I know in physician conflicts, my work there led me to recognize that when I was at the American Medical Association, that some conflicts you just have to prohibit, they're too risky. Should we as legislators be doing more to prohibit some relationships in addition to the disclosures? So again, thank you for a very important and interesting paper, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thanks very much. Before we turn it over to question time here, I want to give both of you a moment for discussion. If you have any additional questions or responses to Dr. O's feedback.
Well, thank you, Representative Ortmaker. Regarding proposals for anti-conflict laws, if it may be of interest, 2 of the 7 states actually provide a means for lobbyists to report these conflicts to state officials. So in Texas, the Secretary of State provides forms for lobbyists to take to the client, get a signature, and then bring back to the Secretary of State's office. And in Pennsylvania, the State Ethics Commission has a similar procedure. The other 5, it's just like that law that you showed us earlier from Colorado. It does not require any sort of reporting of the conflict. So we know that every session, several dozen conflict forms are submitted in the state of Texas, and I'm not sure about in Pennsylvania, but there are those differences between the state facilitating reporting and this being completely voluntary. So personally, I don't know anything else about the compliance with the anti-conflict law outside of Texas and Pennsylvania. I want to thank you very much for your comments. These are really interesting, especially regarding the physician conflict of interest and moral licensing among advisors. These are angles I had not thought about earlier, and I will be looking up some of these citations and seeing if they may be very relevant for the theory to place into the paper as well. And I'm happy to talk further. And I also appreciated your cynical interpretation presented towards the end, that perhaps hospitals and health insurance companies don't mind hiring tobacco lobbyists because their interests may align somewhat. I am willing to put that into the possible conclusion section of the paper, and maybe we'll see if reviewers appreciate that. So, or not. Thank you. So.
Thanks very much. And I think with that, we are ready to move into just a few minutes of questions. Our first comes from Donald Mullins, who asks, has Dr. Strickland looked at the inverse situation? In Florida, we also have traditional healthcare lobbyists who are now also registered with tobacco companies. Registration and disclosure websites appear to be the strongest tool for potential clients looking to retain a lobbyist.
That's a great question. So the current study does not look at any sort of changes over time. So hypothetically, I could look at one or two states or a few more and to identify lobbyists who represent healthcare first and then represent tobacco, or the other way around to see what's happening. Right now, we're just looking at legislative sessions from as many states as possible to get as much variation as possible for anti-conflict laws and competition for access. So I certainly that would be possible. I haven't looked at it. I think there was a second part of the question as well, Ian. Is it possible to, oh, I pull it up here. So registration and disclosure websites appear to be the strongest tool. Yeah, I agree. You know, there's only one study out there that I know of that found verified statistically, I suppose you could say, that clients actually use these websites. And presumably, yes, all clients can check a registration directory to see who represents whom in the Capitol. I don't think that's a problem for our theory, because that just still demonstrates that there's acceptable levels of risk on the part of hospitals and health institutions.
Excellent. And it looks like we have a question from Seth. Seth, go ahead.
Great, thank you. I thought the paper and the discussion were really interesting, and some of Dr. O's points prompted me to wonder the following, which is perhaps the tort law or the basic law about fiduciary responsibility of any professional is different in the states that don't have the disclosure requirement, or sorry, the conflict of interest requirement. So suppose I'm in a state where fiduciary expectations are very high for any professional, then it would seem to me that that would impose upon the lobbyist the requirement that they, well, in anticipation of future litigation, they might exclude strong conflicts of interest because of anticipated fiduciary responsibilities to clients with conflicting interests. Anyway, just a thought.
So that's something I have not thought about before. So I can try and see if the tort laws, fiduciary responsibilities, as I understand, could be correlated with conflicts as well, and possibly even cause that anti-conflict law correlation to go away. Thank you. I will look into that. I didn't know if Dr. O had anything to say, or.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and definitely worth looking at. Noting that Pennsylvania and Texas have two of the better laws, that doesn't, I may be underestimating Texas and thinking they wouldn't be a state with strong fiduciary responsibilities, but I may be unfairly viewing Texas. So it's definitely a good thing to look at.
That was my prejudice as well. Dr. O was thinking that Texas might not have the strongest tort or fiduciary laws.
All right. I think we have a question from Ben Ike. Ben, would you like to hop on, or I'm happy to ask it for you?
I can hop on, but I think for now I'll just be the voice here. And the question that I have, one, great presentation from both of you. I was curious, Professor Strickland, observationally, have you noticed trends in conflicts of interest among lobbyists in states where the legislatures have narrow partisan majorities? resulting in more national attention and scrutiny on their state legislature elections?
So I have not looked at how, I have not controlled for partisan majority sizes within the states. And I think that's interesting. So Ben, is the idea that if there's a high stakes, very competitive legislative environment, that the press are more willing to call out conflicts of interest like in the slideshow, or is there some other mechanism at work there? Just to get an idea of where you're headed.
But willing to call it out, but also incentive of large corporations like Big Tobacco or for larger hospital conglomerates to really put more and more money through lobbying efforts into the coffers of campaigns that could result in more of an incentive for these sort of conflicts of interest to arise. I would just be curious to see if there's some sort of a comparative analysis that could be done looking at states that have, let's say, 10 or fewer seats in the majority, and it's very competitive. There's a lot of national interests. You have people in other states that are putting yard signs in their front yard to encourage keeping the majority one side or the other. People are donating. It would be really interesting to see when you get to that level of national scrutiny on state level races. Do you see this increase of these sorts of conflicts of interest? And further, does that bother us? Is that something that is worth monitoring and tracking and seeing if this changes legislator behavior or even potentially results of elections? Who knows? I think that could be something worth considering.
Oh, I see what you mean now. So it would be straightforward for me to control for legislative majority sizes. There are, as you may know, these indices that have been used for several decades now in the states. The best I can do to answer your question would be to say that in previous work, I don't think that there was a correlation generally between partisan majority size and multi-client lobbying in general. And multi-client lobbying may or may not be correlated with conflicts, but that's the best I can do for you at this point. And what I will do instead, in addition, is to write down this variable, and I will see how it compares, because certainly the data are there, and it would not take very long to test that idea.
Well, thank you, Professor. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Made me think of one thing I've noticed in the move from Indiana to Nevada. One big difference is we have much less coverage by the press in Nevada than we had in Indiana. And I can think of two possible reasons. One is, as a media person pointed out to me, Indianapolis is a big city, capital. That's where the legislature meets. In Nevada is Carson City, a small, 60,000 people. So the media, the Las Vegas media are 7 hours drive away. So it may be that, so I don't know if there's a correlation between capitals and out of the way places. The Pennsylvania example, well, Harrisburg is not a major metropolis, so that may not matter. The other thing that occurred to me that I thought about was the decline in the media. Can't afford it, right? The media has been shrinking. They aren't able to afford as much. So that would be one thing, is whether you could see any effect about media attention, spending, and then the other thing that's true about Nevada compared to Indiana is we don't have common cause in Nevada. So do states with common cause, are they more likely to have better, stricter rules?
That's interesting. Certainly the records could tell us if there are these good government reform groups like Common Cause active within the state. So maybe they could play a role in publicizing conflicts or other sorts of relationships. The only thing that I can say regarding the size of the state capital city is that I could see that, and it's totally possible. There are fixed effects for states within the current regression models, but as we all know, some state capital cities have grown a lot faster than others, so the fixed effects won't be correlated with the population of capital cities. So I'll take a look. Again, that should be available, the data. So yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think we are just about running out the clock here. Thank you all for joining us today for our inaugural State Oversight Academy Symposium. What an excellent series of discussions and a great group of people. Thank you, Dr. Strickland, Dr. Orentliker, for that fabulous discussion to round us out. Thank you to all of our panelists today, and a big thank you as well to our colleagues here at the Levin Center, seen and unseen, who have put so much work into a fabulous event today. One of the great pleasures of our work with the State Oversight Academy is sitting here at the intersection of academia and the practice of politics and government. That intersection is an exciting place to help make sense of and improve our world. And I hope you've enjoyed as much as I have spending your afternoon at this intersection of the best of all possible worlds. At the risk of falling back on the go-to scholarly conclusion, more research is needed. State legislatures and state legislative oversight is a great field. It's an important field, and it doesn't always get the attention it deserves. So for the scholars who joined us today, thank you. And if you're someone who's interested in this field of study, keep in touch. We're happy to help. We would love to have you join us at next year's symposium. If you enjoyed today's program, I know you'll also be interested in many of our other programs. You can visit stateoversight.org to see more of our events, including many panels just like this one, and sign up for our newsletter to keep up with what we are up to. Also on the website, we have a fabulous state legislative oversight wiki with information on state legislative institutions and their oversight partners in every state and territory. And we make house calls or Senate calls. If you work with a state legislative institution that does oversight work, Ben and I would love to visit and conduct an oversight workshop with your legislators and staff. No matter what, keep in touch. Whether you're a scholar or a practitioner of oversight or just really interested, who couldn't be? We're always glad to hear from you, and we're happy to help however we can. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for your work and for your interest in this field. And from me and all of us here, have a great weekend.